really did not get along
in real life.
In real life.
I did not know this.
Yeah. Like we didn't get. But every single week before taping, we'd come together.
Eddie Griffin has always been known for his sharp wit, quick humor, and unfiltered honesty. But when he recently spoke about Malcolm-Jamal Warner, the tone in his voice was different. Softer, heavier, and filled with an emotional weight that instantly silenced the room. It wasn't the Eddie people are used to seeing on stage or in interviews, cracking jokes and making everyone laugh. This was Eddie the friend, Eddie the man who had seen something that deeply affected him, and Eddie who felt the need to share a story that, while difficult, carried an important truth. As he began speaking, there was a brief pause, the kind that lets you know the person is choosing their words carefully. He explained that Malcolm had been going through things most people would never imagine. Behind the polished public image, the confident smile, and the professional success, there was a private world of challenges that Malcolm rarely let anyone see. Eddie revealed that some of these struggles were emotional, some were deeply personal, and some came from pressures that built up over years in the entertainment industry. He talked about the weight of expectations that Malcolm had carried from a young age. Being in the public eye for so long meant that every decision, every action, and even every personal setback was magnified. Eddie described how Malcolm often felt the pressure to live up to the image people had of him, and how that pressure, over time, became a silent burden. While fans saw the polished performances, the interviews, and the appearances, they didn't see the moments of doubt, the sleepless nights, and the quiet struggles that came when the cameras were off. Eddie's voice grew more emotional as he shared how these challenges began to take a toll on Malcolm's mental and emotional well-being. There were moments, Eddie said, when Malcolm seemed distant, lost in thought, as if carrying the weight of something too heavy to put into words. Eddie admitted that he had tried to reach out during those times, offering support, encouragement, and a listening ear. Sometimes Malcolm would open up, and sometimes he would retreat, preferring to deal with his pain privately. The most heartbreaking part of Eddie's account was the way he described Malcolm's resilience in the face of it all. Despite the personal battles, Malcolm continued to work, to create, and to inspire those around him. Eddie admired how he never let his struggles define him, even when the weight of them was almost unbearable. He explained that Malcolm's strength wasn't in pretending everything was fine, but in finding ways to keep going, even when the world didn't know what he was going through. Eddie's revelation wasn't about gossip or drama. It was about showing the human side of someone who had been placed on a pedestal for most of his life. It was a reminder that no matter how successful or admired someone may be, they can still face challenges that test them in ways no one else can fully understand. Eddie's words were raw, heartfelt, and filled with respect for Malcolm's journey. The room was quiet when he finished, and it was clear that his story had touched everyone who heard it. Eddie Griffin continued his account, this time going even deeper into the parts of Malcolm-Jamal Warner's life that most people never knew about. He explained that what made Malcolm's struggles so profound wasn't just the challenges themselves, but the way they quietly stacked up over years. Eddie described it as a slow, almost invisible erosion, one that chips away at a person's peace without anyone noticing until it's already taken a toll. For Malcolm, this erosion began early, in the years when the spotlight seemed like a blessing but secretly carried a heavy price. Eddie recalled conversations where Malcolm would speak candidly, his guard lowered, revealing fears and frustrations that he never voiced publicly. He admitted that sometimes Malcolm questioned whether he had sacrificed too much of himself for the sake of his career, the privacy he lost, the relationships strained by the constant demands of fame, and the feeling that no matter how much he gave, it was never quite enough for the world watching him. Eddie emphasized that these weren't the thoughts of someone ungrateful, but of someone human, someone who had been carrying an invisible backpack filled with years of emotional weight. One of the most powerful moments Eddie shared was about an evening they spent together away from the noise of the industry. They had been sitting in a quiet space, no cameras, no audience, just two people talking as friends. Malcolm had opened up about the loneliness that often came with his life. It wasn't the kind of loneliness you could fix by simply being around people. It was deeper, tied to the fact that very few truly understood his reality. Eddie said that in that moment he saw the difference between being admired and being understood, and how Malcolm, despite all the admiration, often longed for the latter. Eddie's voice grew heavier as he recounted how these private moments had changed the way he saw Malcolm. The man who appeared strong, confident, and always in control on the outside was, in truth, someone who carried scars most people would never see. Some of these scars came from disappointments, projects that didn't work out, opportunities lost, and times when he felt overlooked despite his talent and dedication. Others came from personal heartbreaks, the kind that leave quiet cracks in a person's spirit. And yet, Eddie said, What made Malcolm remarkable was his refusal to let those scars turn into bitterness. Instead, he used them as reminders of what he had survived. Eddie admired how Malcolm continued to treat people with kindness and respect, even when life had not always treated him the same way. He saw in Malcolm a kind of quiet courage, not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the everyday kind that allows a person to keep showing up, keep creating, and keep believing that better days are possible. In one particularly moving part of his story, Eddie described how Malcolm had once told him that his goal in life was no longer to chase perfection, but to find peace. That simple statement stayed with Eddie, because it spoke volumes about what Malcolm had been through. After years of trying to meet impossible expectations, both his own and others, Malcolm had reached a point where peace was more valuable than applause. Eddie said he respected that more than any award, any recognition, or any achievement. As Eddie spoke, it became clear that his revelation wasn't meant to evoke pity, but to inspire empathy. He wanted people to understand that behind every public figure is a private life filled with battles we may never see. He wanted Malcolm's story to serve as a reminder that even those who seem to have it all can be fighting for their emotional well-being every single day. Eddie's honesty and vulnerability in sharing this left a lasting impression, not just about Malcolm, but about the importance of compassion in how we view others. When Eddie finally paused, the weight of his words lingered. It was more than a story, it was a window into a man's soul, one that revealed both the pain and the perseverance that defined him. Malcolm-Jamal Warner's journey, as told by Eddie Griffin, was not one of tragedy alone, but of strength, resilience, and the quiet dignity of carrying on when the world has no idea what you've endured. Eddie Griffin leaned back slightly as he spoke, his eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and sorrow. By this point in his account, it was clear that what he was sharing about Malcolm-Jamal Warner was not just the story of a friend, it was the story of a man who had endured in silence for far too long. Eddie said that the most heartbreaking truth was not in the specific events Malcolm had faced, but in the way he carried them. It was in the quiet acceptance of pain, the calm nod when life handed him another obstacle, and the unspoken decision to keep going no matter how heavy the burden became. Eddie remembered one conversation vividly. It was during a period when Malcolm's personal and professional life seemed to be colliding in a storm of uncertainty. Projects he had been passionate about were stalling, relationships were strained, and his health, both emotional and physical, was being tested. Eddie said that when he asked Malcolm how he was holding up, Malcolm simply smiled and said, "I'm still here." At first, it sounded like a simple answer, but Eddie realized those 3 words held an ocean of meaning. They were not about being fine, they were about surviving. He explained how, in many ways, Malcolm's strength was his ability to endure without bitterness. Most people, after years of being misunderstood, overlooked, or underappreciated, might let resentment take root. But Malcolm didn't. He had a quiet discipline about him, an inner belief that life was more than the sum of its disappointments. Eddie admired this deeply because he knew it wasn't easy to live that way, especially in an industry that often values image over truth and applause over authenticity. One of the most emotional parts of Eddie's reflection came when he described the sacrifices Malcolm had made for the sake of his career. These weren't just missed events or canceled plans. They were deeper sacrifices, time with loved ones, moments of rest, and the chance to simply live without pressure. Eddie pointed out that fame has a way of demanding everything from a person while giving very little back in terms of real fulfillment. Malcolm had learned to navigate that, but the cost was written in the tiredness behind his eyes and the rare moments when his guard slipped. Eddie also recalled seeing Malcolm in moments of deep reflection, sitting quietly with a distant look as if he was replaying memories only he could understand. Sometimes he would share small pieces of those memories, losses that shaped him, decisions he wished had gone differently, or times when he had to walk away from opportunities because they conflicted with his values. Eddie believed these were the moments that truly defined Malcolm, because they showed not just his professional resilience but his moral strength. In another story Eddie shared, he talked about how Malcolm had once turned down a project that could have brought him significant attention, simply because it didn't align with his principles. It wasn't an easy decision, and Eddie knew it came at a cost, but it was one of the many examples of Malcolm choosing integrity over convenience. Eddie respected this deeply, and it reinforced his belief that Malcolm's greatest achievements were not just the roles he played on screen, but the man he chose to be off camera. By the time Eddie finished this part of his story, the room felt heavy, not because of sadness alone, but because of the powerful truth he had laid out. Malcolm-Jamal Warner's journey was one of survival, dignity, and quiet heroism. Eddie's words painted the picture of a man who had been tested repeatedly, yet never lost the core of who he was. The heartbreak was real, but so was the hope, Hope found in the fact that even in the face of immense personal battles, Malcolm continued to move forward, not for recognition, but for the sake of living a life that stayed true to his values. Eddie ended this section with a simple thought: you don't really know someone until you've seen them at their lowest and still see their worth. In that moment, it was clear that his revelation about Malcolm wasn't meant to expose weakness, but to honor the quiet strength of a man who had endured more than most will ever know. Eddie Griffin's voice grew softer as he entered what felt like the most vulnerable part of his revelation. Up to this point, he had spoken about Malcolm-Jamal Warner's challenges, resilience, and sacrifices, but now he began to describe moments that left a permanent mark on both of their lives. Eddie said that there are certain experiences that carve themselves into a person's soul, changing the way they see the world forever. For Malcolm, those experiences were not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes they were quiet moments of realization that the people and things you love the most can slip away, no matter how much you try to hold on. Eddie recalled one particular night when Malcolm had been dealing with the loss of someone who had played an important role in his life. It wasn't a loss that made headlines or drew public sympathy. It was personal, intimate, and deeply painful. Eddie described how Malcolm sat with him in silence for a long time before speaking, his voice steady but weighted. "You think you have time," Malcolm said quietly, "until you realize you don't." Eddie admitted that the raw truth in those words stayed with him ever since. They weren't just about grief, they were about the fragile nature of life itself. This was the side of Malcolm that the public rarely saw, a man who felt things deeply but chose to carry his pain privately, never using it for attention or sympathy. Eddie explained that while many people in the entertainment industry learned to turn their personal hardships into public narratives, Malcolm preferred to protect his experiences, letting them shape him quietly from within. It was, Eddie believed, part of why he admired him so much. Malcolm's strength came not from pretending he was unbreakable, but from allowing himself to feel every fracture and still keep moving forward. Eddie also spoke about how Malcolm had a way of offering wisdom without forcing it on anyone. During times when Eddie himself was struggling, Malcolm would often share small pieces of advice, not in the form of lectures, but in simple, thoughtful statements that stayed in your mind long after the conversation ended. "Peace is expensive," Malcolm once told him, "but it's worth everything you have." Eddie said that at the time he didn't fully understand what Malcolm meant, but over the years the meaning became clear, that protecting your mental and emotional well-being often requires walking away from things that once seemed essential. Another memory Eddie shared was of a time when they were both at an event filled with industry pressure and artificial smiles. Amid the noise and the lights, Malcolm quietly stepped away from the crowd and stood by himself, watching the scene unfold. When Eddie asked him what he was doing, Malcolm simply replied, "Just reminding myself that none of this lasts." It was a moment that revealed how deeply Malcolm understood the temporary nature of success and the importance of not losing yourself in it. Eddie emphasized that Malcolm's perspective wasn't born out of cynicism, but out of survival. He had learned, through experience, that chasing constant approval from others was an endless and exhausting game. Instead, he focused on what he could control: his actions, his values, and the kind of man he wanted to be. Eddie saw this as one of Malcolm's greatest strengths, his ability to remain grounded in an environment designed to pull people away from their true selves. The most heartbreaking truth Eddie revealed was that Malcolm's journey was still ongoing, that despite all he had endured, there were still challenges ahead. But rather than letting that reality defeat him, Malcolm accepted it as part of life. Eddie's voice trembled slightly as he spoke about how rare it is to see someone embrace both the beauty and the pain of life without letting either define them completely. When Eddie finished this part of his story, there was a long silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from awkwardness, but the kind that comes when people are processing something deeply human. His words had stripped away the layers of fame and image, leaving only the truth, that Malcolm-Jamal Warner was not just an actor or a public figure, but a man who had walked through fire and still found a way to keep his heart intact. Eddie ended with a thought that summed up everything he had been trying to say: you can survive almost anything if you know who you are. And he knows who he is. It was a statement filled with respect, admiration, and a quiet kind of heartbreak, because knowing yourself, Eddie implied, often comes at a cost that only you will ever truly understand. Eddie Griffin took a deep breath before moving into what felt like the final and most personal part of his revelation. He had spoken about Malcolm-Jamal Warner's struggles, his sacrifices, his quiet wisdom, and his resilience, but now he wanted to share what those qualities had truly meant, not just to Malcolm's life but to the lives of those who knew him. Eddie's voice carried a weight that made it clear this was no longer just a story, it was a tribute. He began by explaining that Malcolm's greatest strength had always been his ability to remain human in a world that often demanded something else entirely. In the entertainment industry, Eddie said, there is a constant push to be larger than life, to project an image of perfection, to hide any vulnerability that might make you seem less marketable. But Malcolm refused to play that game. He showed up as himself, flaws, scars, and all, and in doing so he gave others permission to be real too. Eddie recalled a conversation where Malcolm told him, "If I'm not honest with myself, nothing else I do will matter." It was a statement that stuck with him because it explained so much about the way Malcolm lived. Whether he was turning down opportunities that didn't align with his principles or choosing to step away from toxic situations, Malcolm's decisions were guided by a clear sense of self-respect. Eddie admired that deeply, especially because he knew how much harder it was to stand by your values when you're under constant public scrutiny. He then shared one of the most touching moments he had ever witnessed. A time when Malcolm, without saying a word, comforted someone going through an intense personal loss. Eddie described how Malcolm simply sat beside them, listening, offering presence instead of platitudes. "He doesn't try to fix you," Eddie said. "He just makes sure you don't feel alone." That, Eddie explained, was one of the most valuable things about Malcolm. His understanding that sometimes, the best thing you can give someone is your time and your attention. Eddie admitted that watching Malcolm navigate his own challenges had changed the way he saw life. He realized that true resilience isn't about being untouched by pain, but about carrying that pain with grace and refusing to let it strip away your kindness. Malcolm's journey had been filled with moments that could have hardened him, but instead, they had made him more compassionate, more grounded, and more determined to live with integrity. One of the hardest truths Eddie revealed was that Malcolm's battles were not over. Life, he said, has a way of continuing to test those who have already been tested. But instead of resenting that fact, Malcolm accepted it. He saw challenges not as punishments but as reminders that nothing, not even hardship, lasts forever. Eddie respected that mindset, even though he knew it was one earned through years of painful lessons. As he reached the end of his story, Eddie became reflective. He said that if there was one thing people should take away from Malcolm's life, it was the understanding that you never truly know what someone is going through. The smiles, the achievements, the appearances, they can all hide a reality that is far more complex and far more fragile. Eddie's revelation wasn't meant to make people pity Malcolm, but to encourage them to see him and others with deeper compassion. The room was quiet as Eddie delivered his closing words. "We all have chapters we don't read out loud. His just happened to be written in ink that only a few of us have seen. But every page I've read tells me the same thing. He's still standing, and that's not just survival. That's strength." It was a simple statement, but it carried the full weight of everything Eddie had shared. In those words was the essence of Malcolm-Jamal Warner's journey, a journey of endurance, of loss, of unwavering principles, and of finding a way to remain whole in a world that often tries to break you apart. Eddie's voice lingered in the air, and for a moment, it felt as if everyone in the room was carrying a small piece of Malcolm's story with them. For Eddie, this was never about headlines or gossip. It was about honoring a man he respected, a friend whose quiet courage had left a mark on his own life. And in telling the world what he had seen, Eddie ensured that Malcolm's story would not just be remembered for the roles he played on screen, but for the role he played in real life, as a reminder that dignity, compassion, and resilience are worth more than any spotlight.